This is the Comics Alternative Critical Takes, a conversation with Keith Dallas and Jason Sachs. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Critical Takes. I'm Derek, and on this episode I talk with Keith Dallas and Jason Sachs about their latest volume in the TwoMorrows Publishing series, American Comic Book Chronicles. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Critical Takes is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find Keith and Jason's latest work, American Comic Book Chronicles, the 1990s, for 25% off the cover price. And while you're at it, you can get similar discounts on other volumes within the American Comic Book Chronicles series, including ones covering the 1950s, the 1970s, and both volumes focusing on the 1960s. All of this just goes to show that you can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. On this, our second show in the new Critical Take series, I have back on the podcast Keith Dallas, co-author of the new book, American Comic Book Chronicles, the 1990s. Listeners might remember that I talked with Keith, along with John Wells, back last summer when their book, Comic Book Implosion, was released by TwoMorrows Publishing. In fact, that was our very first Critical Takes episode. This time around, Keith is joined by Jason Sachs, another comic scholar and historian who has worked on other texts within the American Comic Book Chronicles series. The two have just released their volume on the 1990s, a curious and tumultuous time in American comics history. As you'll hear in our conversation, Jason and Keith discuss in detail their firsthand experiences during this decade, the process of researching for this project, the various stereotypes that they had to overcome when encapsulating the decade, and what each of them sees as key defining moments for comics during the 1990s. They also talk with me about the genesis of the American Comic Book Chronicles series and what we might expect with future volumes. Both Keith and Jason have a lot to share, so let's listen to their insights right now. I'm pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Keith Dallas and Jason Sachs. They have a new book out from TwoMorrows Publishing, American Comic Book Chronicles, the 1990s. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us, Derek.
Thank you, Derek.
Mm-hmm. And Keith, I'm having you back because if our listeners recall, I had you and John Wells on back in the summer of last year. And by the way, Happy New Year to both of you.
Yes, you too.
Happy New Year.
But I had Keith, you and John on the show back in the summer of 2018 to talk about your DC Comics Implosion book. And that was a really fun conversation. And we were talking at the time about having you and Jason on the show when the American Comic Book Chronicle 1990s book was released. And this just came out in December of last year.
That's right.
And I want to talk with the two of you primarily about this new book, the 1990s volume. But before that, I think it may be useful to talk about the American Comic Book Chronicles series as a whole. Maybe introduce it to some of our listeners who may not have picked up a volume, which they should. I absolutely love that series. And talk a little bit about its genesis and the work that the two of you have done with not only the 1990s volume, but previous volumes.
Sure. And thanks for the compliment. So American Comic Book Chronicles is sort of a decade-by-decade look at comic book history. There's actually going to be essentially like a 1930s volume. So we go from the 1930s all the way through the 1990s with, each volume goes year by year through a decade, with the 1940s and the 1960s actually split between two volumes. And, we try to document as much as we can in a 280-page book. All the publishers and all the creators and all the significant publications, all the significant industry trends and developments, so that the reader is presented with as comprehensive a look at the comic book industry as possible. And it's now been, it's actually going to be 11 years ago when this project first started. It emerged out of my work on the Flash Companion, with which Jason contributed to. And the Flash Companion was, very successful. If for people who are not familiar with TwoMorrows Publishing, they about 10 years ago put out a series of companion books based on DC titles. So help me out, Jason. So there was like a Teen Titans companion, there was a Legion of Superheroes companion, there was a Batman companion, a Superman companion,
Hawkman.
There was a Hawkman companion. There was a Blue Beetle companion. So eventually that had to be discontinued because DC's licensing fee became too prohibitive. But again, the Flash Companion ended up being one of the final companion books that TwoMorrows published. That was in 2008. And John Morrow appreciated the work, obviously appreciated how well it sold, and asked me to come up with some other ideas. And the caveat, he said, is that, look, that whatever idea you come up with cannot be an exclusive DC or Marvel project, because the licensing fees we just can't pay the fees that they're trying to levy. So I came up with the idea of a book about 1980s comic books. I said, look, you could, not only do you have DC and Marvel, I mean, obviously we needed to come up with an idea that fell under the fair use, So I said, not only, obviously I grew up with 1980s comic books. I loved, those independent publishers like Comico, and Eclipse and Dark Horse, and I said, why don't we put out a book about the 1980s? We'll go year by year. And John said, I love that idea, but I don't want it limited to the 1980s. I want to do the entire history of comic books. I said, okay, well, I can definitely write the book on the 1980s. Let me pull together some pals to handle the other volume. So that's when I contacted John Wells for the 1960s volumes. Jason got pulled in for the 1970s volume, and we had Bill Shelley write the 1950s volume. Roy Thomas was tapped to do the 1940s volumes. He ultimately became inundated with other projects, so he recommended Kurt Mitchell, who so that's the next volume coming out in 2019, is the first 1940s volume. And so, we're coming close to the end. Here we are, 11 years later, and we're coming close to the end of the project. Thank God. I joke with John Morrow that, and it's half joking, that this project would be the death of me. So,
hey, that's just working with me, Keith, right? Having to edit my writing.
No. So it's just, I mean, and obviously, Jason, you can attest to this. Is when you describe this project, it's like, oh, great, it sounds. It sounds wonderful. It is wonderful, but the amount of work involved in each one of these volumes is tremendous. Just not only the amount of research, but presenting the research, presenting the comic book history in a way that is entertaining. And that's just as challenging as the research itself, which can be bogged down in a sort of he said type of dilemma. So whose account do we go with here? Especially, once you get to say the 1990s, where there are several different accounts being published, not only at the time but afterwards.
So let's say some of the controversies surrounding, and we can see this in the new book, Jim Shooter, let's say, and his work with various publishers and his own, I guess, outlets as well. It gets into this he said that you're describing.
Yep.
Yeah, and Shooter's an interesting example because I've also written a book about Jim Shooter Conversations for University Press of Mississippi, which involved doing an about 6-hour interview with Shooter. So I've heard his side of the story in great detail, as well as editing it. But there's interesting stories around him where we saw many different sides of a story. When he left Valiant Comics in 1992, there were literally 5 or 6 different stories floating around about why Shooter left. He tells the story about his former business partner, Steve Masarsky, getting involved with a woman from the finance department, and they basically pushed him out as a way of asserting their ownership of the company. Other people say that Shooter was looking to take over full ownership of the characters or partial ownership of the characters, which he knew wouldn't sustain the company, and therefore he basically set himself up to leave. And there's a lot of cases where we just have to present multiple images of the same story because we just hear so many different stories around it. The other thing that's been really interesting for me about working on this book, and one of the things we did was really work from original source material, magazines and other material from the time, even more than talking to people now, because we found that was more accurate, gave a better portrait of the way that the industry kind of took shape at the time. And so like in 1991, 92, when Image Comics was being created, of course, now 30 years on, we all see this, a lot of the hype around it is around this kind of being a preordained thing that Image would strike a blow for creator ownership in the industry. At the time, though, it was a bunch of guys in their 20s who kind of just wanted to have a chance to make more money from their properties and really be more free with things. And so it's kind of fun to go back and see kind of the looseness around the creation of Image that's kind of been not swept under the rug, but definitely downplayed since then. And I just find that kind of thing just a lot of fun because it pulls out the idea that these are just a bunch of guys improvising in their lives. And from that standpoint, like, it makes them a lot more relatable.
I find the parts of this new book on the 1990s as it relates to Image and its history quite fascinating, along with the space that you devote to Vertigo. And I want to come back to that later on in our conversation. But looking at the series as a whole, the American Comic Book Chronicles, now, Keith, you had mentioned that you're about to wrap up. So we will see later this year, I guess maybe around summer is what I saw on the TwoMorrows website, that the first 1940s book that Mitchell and Thomas are doing, 1940 to 1944, that's going to be coming out. And then there's going to be a 1945 to 1949 that will, you have any idea when that one maybe
probably
released?
early 2020. Probably
Okay.
early 2020.
Okay, and then you had also mentioned that there's going to be a 1930s volume.
Yep. So that Bob Hughes wrote that, and John and I have been, going back and forth on how to release that. His initial idea was to come out with like a slipcase for the entire series.
Oh,
and
wow.
include the 1930 volume with the slipcase. That ultimately became impractical from a shipping standpoint, just trying to ship out all of these slipcases. And so we're now and his concern is, and this isn't just a concern with the 1930s volume, but with TwoMorrows books in general, is that the pre-orders on a 1930s volume would not be high enough to justify the cost of a print run. Because as you can imagine, and Derek, you have a hard copy of the 1990s volume, yes, or you only have it digital? Okay, so these are hardcover, full color, like coffee table type of books. These are really expensive to print, and John has to sort of outlay a lot of money, and then wait a bunch of months before recovering the cost of that print run. So his concern is, what type of print run would a 1930s volume? What type of pre-orders would a 1930s volume generate? So we are considering doing a Kickstarter campaign for the 1930s volume, which, and I think because I've been trying to get John Morrow into Kickstarter campaigns, because there are projects that I know he wants to greenlight, but he's got qualms about them. And again, this is outside of American Comic Book Chronicles. And I said, look, Kickstarter is like the perfect testing ground to see if there's interest. Because if there is, then you've generated enough funds through the Kickstarter campaign to pay for the print run, so that now you're not worried about being, short money. And if the Kickstarter campaign doesn't succeed, okay, there you go. Then that you don't, not to go ahead with the project. You've just saved yourself money by not greenlighting a project that potentially doesn't break a profit.
You talk about the production value, and I think that these books are beautiful in terms of the hardcover, the size, the color, the glossy pages, the images that you include, and the design. I mean, all of that, in addition to the content, which I think is really valuable. And in fact, and Keith, I think I mentioned this to you, but a previous version that the two of you worked on, the 1970s, that came out in fall of 2014, I actually reviewed that for the Comics Journal image text. And one of the things I pointed out was, in addition to the content and what you get from that, it is just a beautiful book.
Well, thank you.
So, yeah, I really appreciate the work that all of you and TwoMorrows puts into this series. I'm wondering, might there be a volume of the first decade of the 2000s? Any plans?
I mean, Jason's laughing because he knows what I'm about to say next. Derek, I just told you that this series is going to send me to an early grave, and now you want to extend it by a decade.
Well, I like the series. What do you expect?
No, I appreciate that desire. It's okay. The first decade of the 21st century becomes a distinct challenge, in the sense that, I mean, not only just from, okay, are we starting to move away from, because TwoMorrows Publishing has a pretty set fan base that seems mostly rooted in 60s, 70s, and 80s books, right? John Morrow, I think I've told you this, Jason, that John Morrow had some serious qualms about the 1990s volume, that he was sort of crossing his fingers that the book would would get the pre-orders. He really thought that the pre-orders for the 1990 volume were going to be significantly lower than they were on the 60s, 70s, and 80s volume. And thankfully, that proved not to be the case, that the pre-orders actually were at the same levels as the other volumes, which I guess is a testament to, people. Because, right, Jason, we've seen online, Jason, that, there are certain people that they don't just buy one volume. They may not buy every single volume, but they'll buy more than one volume, right? Is that, Jason,
Well, they look so great on a bookshelf together. As you said, they all have such beautiful production values that I found myself, I was not very interested in the 1950s era. But as soon as I started reading the book, I just fell in love with it. I couldn't put the book down because it's just a great overview of the decade. And so, I think people do love to buy multiple volumes of it.
Yeah, okay, so John Morrow's got to weigh out, even though the typical TwoMorrows Publishing consumer really isn't interested in 21st century comic books, would they buy a volume on 21st century comic books because they've bought all these other volumes? So that's concern number one. Concern number two, and Jason and I have spoken about this, Derek, is when you think about how comic book history is chronicled over the decades. So in the 1960s, you have a plethora of fanzines, right? In the 1970s, not only do you have the fanzines, but you have publications like the Comic Reader, and you have Comics Buyer's Guide, and Comics Journal, both began in the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, you have Amazing Heroes, which I know is a sister publication of the Comics Journal. But you have these print publications that you can access, and you can see comic book industry news from a month-to-month basis. And that's extended into the 1990s, obviously, through magazines like Wizard and Hero Illustrated. What else, Jason, am I overlooking in the 1990s?
Oh, you can't forget Overstreet's Comic Price Guide.
There you go, yes.
They did monthly over the decade. But yeah.
So you have... I'm sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Was the other one. Yeah. Keep going, Keith.
Okay, so you have, even up to the end of the 1990s, you have these print publications that we can access and chart comic book history, as, with the rumors and, the projects in development and things like, what fans are talking about, right? Once you get into the 21st century, rhetorical question here, how do we get our comic book news? We're looking at news sites like Newsarama and Comic Book Resources and Bleeding Cool. So then once you start into the 21st century, how do we access, because obviously those sites have archived, but they haven't archived it in a way where we can just go through it year by year. I don't know if I'm making sense, Derek.
No, you are. I mean, this does make sense.
And this is something that Mike Tiefenbacher first pointed out. The former editor-in-chief of the Comic Reader. He said, on one hand, obviously with news websites, there's an accessibility there, as opposed to having to buy a subscription to Comics Buyer's Guide or to Comics Journal. But the challenge is, okay, I want to see what people were talking about in 2002. Obviously, I can rely on my memory, which I always caution my authors about doing that, because the things you remember might be first, overly subjective, but, you forget a lot, as the years go on. But trying to now chart comic book history, really, again, these books are challenging enough. And now you have that monkey wrench thrown into it. So I'm reluctant to, obviously, if there's enough interest, if there's enough clamor for a 21st century volume, John will put a gun to my head and say, do it. I'll say on January 1st, 2019, officially there are zero plans to put out such a volume.
Okay.
And have fun finding a new writer to do it, Keith, because I am out. After 4 years of my life spent on this book, I want to move on to other things in my life. It was an amazing accomplishment, and I'm proud to have done it. But man, I don't want to step into the 2000s and the complexity of all that. It's going to be wild.
So you're saying that the 1990s volume was at least 4 years in the making?
Yep.
Yeah, it was. I pitched it to Keith actually right after he finished the 1970s volume. So that's
on the floor of San Diego Comic-Con.
Right.
He approached me and John because we had someone who was attached. I don't want to mention his name, but a very good author. But ultimately, he bowed out just because he just did not have the time to put into the research. And so this was summer of 2014, and we had no one attached. And John and I were at the TwoMorrows booth at the San Diego Comic-Con, and we're, I forget if that exact moment we were discussing it, but I know it was something that we were discussing about trying to figure out what to do with the 1990s volume. And here comes Jason, says, "You know what, guys? If I'll throw my hat into the ring if you feel like I can do it." And I said, "Let's do it."
So both of you were talking about some of the challenges that you faced, I guess, not only with the 1990s book, but the series as a whole, depending on what period of time, what decade a particular volume covers. I'm curious if there has been a decade or a particular volume, because the 1960s is divided into two different volumes. You're going to be doing the same with the 1940s.
Right.
Is there any particular volume or decade that you have found, Keith, as the editor of the series, particularly, I don't want to say difficult, but challenging more so than the others?
Yeah, I mean, they're all challenging for different reasons. Boy, that's an excellent question, Derek. I'm trying to, Jason can, I think will back me up on this, that the 70s volume, oh boy, Jason, how do I phrase this? We inherited a bit of a mess, right? I guess, is that the polite way to put it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And, and again, I'm trying to, protect the guilty here without naming names. So, the project was started. It definitely was not up to snuff. It was definitely the way it was started, and everyone sort of recognized it. And John Morrow basically said, "Look, you guys," upon my recommendation, said, "Look, you guys got to start over," and that's. Jason, I forget if you contacted me or I contacted you. I think I reached out to you, Jason, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
I just
you
said,
did.
"Look, I can't do this by myself. I need help." So it was me, Jason, Dave Dykema, John Wells. Essentially, right? I mean, that's fair to say, Jason, right? The four of us just because we didn't have 4 years to put that book together, and we had like 18 months or something like that to put that book together.
Yeah, but it was interesting because it felt like that book kind of came together more quickly than the 90s book. I don't know why, but it seemed like we just had more ability to smack everything together.
There were more hands on deck.
Yeah, more hands on deck, but also maybe fewer places to look for information and fewer controversies to write about. I mean, I remember writing the 1979 chapter over a weekend and having it be in decent shape. Kind of also because the industry was so down in 79. And it just felt like that book fell into place easier, I guess, than the 90s book.
I don't think I'd agree with that. Again, I mean, listen.
Your mileage may vary.
Yeah, because they're all challenging. They all have their they're all sort of obstacles that had to be overcome. There were difficulties that had to be, there were challenges that had to be met, and so I don't know if I would agree with that assessment, but yeah, I mean, it did for some reason. Dave, We also, excellent question, Derek. You got me on the spot there.
Okay, well, maybe kind of along with this, and it kind of circles back to something that you said earlier, Keith, when you were talking about the genesis of this series, starting with the work that you were doing with Jason on the Flash Companion, right, and John Morrow's decision to discontinue that series just because of high cost of permissions, right?
Right.
Do you find with any of the books within this series any kind of potential drawbacks or, again, challenges, I think would be a good word to use, with getting the rights to use any of the images because it's an image-heavy text, or because you cover the vast field and not just the big two, DC and Marvel, all of that may fall under fair use?
It does fall under fair use. We've had zero. John Morrows has not conveyed to me any complaints from any publisher because I think they all realize that they don't have a leg to stand on, because it is truly, a comprehensive. I mean, you look at the definition of fair use, historical, educational, purposes. We make sure the covers. If you look at the covers for all the volumes, there are no DC or Marvel publications featured. I mean, that was a decision that John Morrow made just to make sure that, because that's what really DC and Marvel harp on. They want to make sure the covers cannot be misleading, so that you're not trying to quote unquote, fool the consumer into believing that you're selling a Marvel product or a DC product. But what you just said actually, triggered for me a response to the previous question is, the 1990s becomes challenged, Derek, because now we have before the 1990s we put out 5 other volumes, and this project doesn't necessarily get easier with every volume. You could argue that it gets even more complicated and challenging, because you have to, with every volume, you have to make sure it aligns in tone and approach to all the other previous volumes. So that, I mean, as an editor, that became a very pressing fixation. And that was sort of the mess that Jason and I inherited with the 1970s volume, is that the way it was started just didn't align with the other volumes. And we had to reset it to make sure that it's reads like, obviously there's going to be some differences in the writing style of Bill Shelley and the writing style of John Wells and the writing style of Jason Sachs, but they all have the same approach to the project, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed in reading all of the works, the volumes that have come out so far, is they're consistent in the way that you lay out the information. And for listeners who may not be familiar with this series, again, I strongly recommend that you check it out and pick up these volumes. But with each chapter, we have a particular year, and on that particular year, you start off with maybe a broader oversight of what may define that particular year, 1965, 1984, what have you. And then you have a timeline, a 2-page spread, which I really enjoy, every chapter's timeline, where you chart visually not only major events from that particular year in terms of comics and comics culture, but also other cultural moments, whether it be pop culture, politics, or what have you, in order to set everything into context. And then the remainder of the chapter covers, and sometimes it starts with major DC events and news, sometimes Marvel events or news. And then you always take a look at other things that were going on, whether it be, let's say, the smaller publishers in the 1950s or 60s, or as we get into the 70s, 80s, and then 90s, indie or alternative publishers and what was going on with them. So you establish a pattern, I think, from the very first books, the 1960 to 64, and then Keith, your 1980s text. And I have seen all of them being fairly consistent in how you present this information, which I appreciate.
Okay, good. That's a relief to know, because that's something that would keep me up at nights. Just making sure that not that essentially that all the volumes can be read as one whole. It obviously, again, there's going to be some distinctions in writing style, but that there's no deviation to the approach. There's no deviation to how these books are laid out,
right? And
described, how certain events are described and how the manner in which they are described.
Yeah.
So that's by the time we're getting to the 1990s volume, and you're grappling with that. You're sort of grappling with the legacy of the project, and making sure that it falls in line with the other volumes, which well,
we have the same designer, David Greenewald, who always does just spectacular work.
Yep.
Yeah, I got to say, my favorite thing to do is walk around a convention floor and show off the book, and basically as soon as I pull it out and show them how beautiful the layouts are, it sells the book immediately.
Yep.
Because it's just such a compelling presentation.
Yeah. David, like you said, Jason, David does just an incredible job with each of these volumes. So Bill Walko designed the 1980s volume, and David took his baton and ran with it with all the other volumes, and really, no complaints regarding the work that he's done. Excuse me.
Let's talk specifically about the 1990s volume, and I want to come back to something that you were discussing earlier, Jason, and that is the significance of Image Comics, which comes into not only to the fore, but comes to birth in the 1990s. One of the things that struck me about the 1990s book is not only with the Image thing, the space that you devote to the history of Image Comics in the early days, but also, as I mentioned earlier, the significance of Vertigo. And it's interesting to read about, I knew this before, but I think both of you chronicle both Image and the beginnings of Vertigo quite well in this new volume. To compare what had been with Image in the early 1990s when it got its start, and then with Vertigo in the 1990s when it was founded, compare that to where Image and Vertigo are today. So I'm curious, in writing the 1990s book with these two publishers or imprints, in the case of Vertigo, did you notice, were you acutely aware of the difference between the then and now with both Image and Vertigo, or with other publishers that you were writing about?
Yeah, I think a lot of the story of the 1990s is kind of the growth of the medium from being kind of a place where people are just creating derivative characters, as they were in the early days of Image in particular, to a place where they were creating really innovative comic artwork. So in the early days of Image, we saw a lot of especially Rob Liefeld creating very derivative characters. Youngblood was a variation on X-Force. He had a character like Blood Wolf, who was a variation on Lobo. And that seemed to be kind of predominating a lot of what was coming out from Image in those days. Obviously, like Supreme, maybe Supreme is the best example of that. Supreme was a Liefeld character who obviously was a pastiche of Superman. Most people feel like those original Supreme comics are unreadable, or at least a very cheesy, archetypical 90s work. By the end of the decade, Alan Moore had taken on Supreme, given the character a lot more life, a lot more complexity, such that it actually became a critically acclaimed comic, which would have been almost unimaginable in 1993 or so. And there's a lot of that that happened in the industry by 99, in part because people had gotten humbled by the crash of the industry. The early Image books sold 1 to 2 million copies per issue. Even the lower selling books were selling in the hundreds of thousands. By the end of the decade, they were struggling to sell 100,000 of anything. And that forced a higher level of quality on the decade. So we see by like 99 a book like Authority or Planetary, which are now recognized classics, coming out through what Wildstorm, which is one of the Image imprints, evolved into, and really getting a lot of attention, as well as books like Battle Chasers and Crimson and Fathom and other books that kind of showed a lot of the potential of what Image could really grow into. It moved beyond just Todd McFarlane doing Spawn into a wide diversity of titles. It's interesting because Image was, or rather, Vertigo was created kind of as the opposite of Image in some ways, whereas Image was on the surface, flashiness, artist focus. Valiant was always, or excuse me, we could talk about Valiant too.
Yeah.
Vertigo. Valiant is an interesting contrast as well. But Vertigo was created to be a kind of writer-driven place. Obviously, it grew out of the work that Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman had done for DC in the 80s and 90s. And really, it always had writers at the center of it. So to me, Vertigo was more of a growth inside its own kind of milieu where like a book like Transmet makes a lot of sense coming out of Vertigo, because you could have imagined that when Karen Berger created the line in 1993, whereas you kind of couldn't have expected Image to have grown into what it became by the end of the decade.
Now, that leads me to another question, and I'm curious if either of you have a feeling for, let's say, the most notable non-DC or Marvel press of the 1990s. And by most notable, I mean not only in terms of its sales or impact, but also in terms of the kind of news that it generated. I mean, was there in creating the 1990s book something that really stood out about some of these smaller presses, like, let's say Topps or Valiant, Defiant, Broadway, or even those that have roots in the 1980s, Malibu or Eclipse? Yeah,
I think I inadvertently put my finger on what I think is the most archetypical press of the 1990s, which is which is Valiant Comics. Mm-hmm. Valiant was created in 1989 by Jim Shooter and his business partners. In 1990, they nearly went bankrupt publishing Nintendo and WWF comics, wrestling comics. And then Jim Shooter decided he wanted to publish superheroes through them. They started a new set of comics, including revivals of books like Magnus Robot Fighter and Solar Man of the Atom. And suddenly they started to kind of capture lightning in the bottle. And so just at the time that the industry was really starting to grow like crazy, they were hyped by Wizard Magazine, produced interesting comics, and became this big company for a short period of time. There's a great story that we tell in the book about on the day that the Death of Superman comic came out, there were two lines around the block at Golden Apple Comics in Los Angeles. One was to get a copy of the Death of Superman, Superman 75. The other was to get a copy of Bloodshot #1, which was an early Valiant book. I'm sorry, it's still early here. I apologize.
One of those publishers that start with a V.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So for a short period of time, Valiant Comics were selling literally in the millions. Their Turok Dinosaur Hunter sold 1.75 million copies in 1993. But out of those 1.75 million copies, maybe 100,000 actually made them into the hands of actual readers. Most of them just sat in the back of comic shops. And from that kind of overexpansion, along with a crossover series that they became involved with called Deathmate, Valiant kind of helped to trigger the downfall of the comics industry, where we had something like 5,000 comic shops closing between 1992 and 1994. And so the line continued on, continually fighting for its own place in the industry. They were bought by a video game company called Acclaim. Acclaim tried to do a couple of different revivals of these characters. And just like the whole comics industry, they just kind of muddled along from about 1995 to 2000. And ironically, by the end of the decade, they were barely selling. Their last book they put out was an attempt to revive an earlier crossover event that was a massive success for them called Unity. Unity in 1992 was a huge, just a blockbuster hit. Unity 2000, on the other hand, sold something like 3,000 copies per issue. And so Valiant really shows like the amazing growth and the amazing drop in sales of the industry, shows the kind of chance that everyone took to expand their companies, and then the fall that we experienced as well. So they're just a really interesting company. Honestly, I think there's a whole book to be written just about their rise and fall in the 1990s.
So in many ways, you feel that Valiant is representative of comics in the 1990s.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The only thing that makes them not representative is that they did focus on story rather than artwork. I mean, Image Comics, especially in the early days, was especially well named because it was all about the image, all about the slickness, all about Rob Liefeld not drawing feet. One of the interesting things is going back to reading these comics again. The early Valiant comics are actually really very good classic comic book storytelling. A lot of that is the influence of Jim Shooter, who is another just fascinating character from the decade, where like the Unity crossover, for example, which spanned all 12 of Vertigo's Valiant's books, had introduced important changes to the characters, really changed the line in a lot of ways, and was a real kind of go for broke kind of way of creating a new world outside your window. And so like their images really, or their ambitions really paid off in a way that I don't think any other publisher's ambitions paid off in the time. And some of their books, I became a big fan of their book Rye, because it's just this amazingly kind of dark sci-fi story about a future Japan that kind of has seen better days. And I just think they were kind of brave in that they tried to do very different things.
You know, as you're talking, Jason, I can't help but think of the way that you guys begin this 1990s volume in your introduction, where you cite the Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times," and you point out that that can be both a blessing and a curse, and then you apply it to what was going on in the 1990s. I don't know. As I was reading that, I was also thinking about the opening of Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Because on the one hand, we have something like Valiant that you were describing. And for me in particular, Vertigo, I absolutely love throughout its history, in fact, even into today. And so that's the best of times. But in many ways, the 1990s saw, if not the creation, then the solidifying of certain aspects of comic culture that really gets on my nerves. And, you know, Jason, you were touching on some of those. The emphasis on slickness and image over story content as, let's say, embodied in what we saw going on in the early days of Image. Also, the reliance on gimmicks like the embossing, the cover design, the multiple covers. Nothing gets on my nerves more in terms of comics today, especially, than certain publishers relying on multiple covers in order to generate sales. And I don't have anything against different covers. It's just when that is overemphasized, it becomes almost ridiculous. And I have to laugh. And we saw that quite a bit in the 1990s, as you guys point out. And how these gimmicks ultimately led in many ways to the fall of comic sales in the 1990s, going from the early 1990s into mid-decade and then toward the end of the not only decade, but century.
I got to say, I kind of fell in love with all these embossed and foil wrapped covers. I collect them now. I was actually just at the shop yesterday and bought like a giant sack of them out of the dollar bin. I found some great Marvel UK comics. I have Shadow Riders #1 right here in my hand with an embossed cover, including Cable, and it's like so awful. It's wonderful.
And you're buying it cheaper than when it was first sold, Jason. And
yes,
you know.
Yeah, which kind of shows where the industry kind of rose and fell exactly. I don't know how many extra copies of Sleepwalker #1 were sold because of the amazing foil cover, but it's just a great relic of the time. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, it was really an emphasis over style over substance, really an emphasis of kind of mediocre storytelling over truly innovative work. And I think we see that. I'm kind of a believer that no matter how an industry grows or shrinks, you're going to see the same percentage of garbage. It's just that there was a lot more garbage back at that time because the industry was so large. In 92, 93, there were hundreds of comics on the stands. And if you looked, you find a lot of good work. And we talk about that in the book. But there's also a lot of stuff like, Death's Head, Elektra, Root of Evil, Avengers and Fantastic Four during that era were just especially bad comics. And, I think that's just kind of the nature of the business, that there's always going to be, what's Sturgeon's Law, 10%, 90% of everything is crap.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that, I got to admit that, and we see, because American Comic Book Chronicles has its own, Facebook group like everyone else does. And I've seen a couple of comments, when we were posting, previews or posting updates. And a couple of people would chime in about how, the 1990s was the worst decade in comic book history. And I feel that's an exaggeration. I think that's, like Jason just said, every single decade in comic book history. Okay, I'll put it this way. If we randomly pick a comic book from every decade of comic book history, the likelihood that the comic book that we pick is, derivative and hackneyed is tremendous. There's actually from every, there's, I think, there's this myth that everything that was published in the 1960s was a gem. That's nonsense. Go to, mid 1970s DC comics. The great majority of them were unreadable. It's a myth that only bad comic books were published in the 1990s. It's just that the bad comic books of the 1990s also sold millions of copies. That's sort of the problem in documenting the decade. But there are some all-time great comic book works that were published in the 1990s that I feel stand the test of time and can be, included in the greatest works, of the medium.
Yeah, there's a lot of forgotten gems from the 90s. Enemy Ace War Idol by George Pratt from 1991. It's a fascinating meditation on war. Stuck Rubber Baby by Howard Cruz is an excellent biographical graphic novel that ties together the civil rights movement to his coming out of the closet. City of Glass by David Mazzucchelli and Paul Karazic is a brilliant, amazingly interesting graphic novel experience. Mazzucchelli also published Rubber Blanket, a 3-issue oversized book that's just a legendarily great comic. As far as mainstream comic, yeah. Go ahead. Just Bone itself. Think about the timelessness of Bone. I think that's so. People will look at, say, they'll say, okay, the 1980s, Alan Moore's Watchmen, and they'll compare it to Rob Liefeld's Youngblood. I'm like, well, that's a ridiculous comparison. Like, well, why don't you compare Watchmen to like what Jason mentioned earlier, like to some of Warren Ellis's works in the late 1990s. That's
Robinson's The Golden Age.
Robinson's The Golden Age. So Starman.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Kurt Busiek's and Alec Ross's Marvels. That's you don't. It's not fair to take the best of one decade and compare it to the worst of another decade. You got to compare apples to apples here.
Yeah, I could go on and on. pre-Unity Valiant comics, as I mentioned, are super solid. Superhero stories. Kurt Busiek and Sean Chen's Iron Man from 98, 99 crosses Tony Stark with James Bond. That's super fun. Busiek's Untold Tales of Spider-Man is a treat. Jim Shooter's Broadway comics are a lot of fun. He has a series called Fatale that's really worth finding out of the quarter bins. It's just a really amazing kind of clever story. The Amalgam comics from 96 and 97 are offbeat treats. Peter David's 90s Supergirl series is underrated. Batman No Man's Land, the 1999 crossover, it really stands up well. And then there are indie books like Strangers in Paradise, Swan, Scud the Disposable Assassin, Through the Habit Trails, Jar of Fools, Castle Waiting, Age of Bronze. It just goes on and on. There's a lot of great comics from that era. Peter Bag's Hate, Love and Rockets continued. There's just a lot of great material that is worth seeking out.
You know, both of you are mentioning quite a variety of titles that we could categorize as alternative or indie, small press, you know, like Hate and Stuck Rubber Baby. And it struck me in reading this 1990s volume that I think when a lot of people think of alternatives to the mainstream, or at least I do, the 1980s immediately come to mind, right? And so we have those that in some ways kind of inherited what was going on in the 60s and 70s with the underground movement. And so you have in the 1980s something like, I mean, obviously a Mouse, you have Raw, but maybe even more important, you have Love and Rockets, right? That got its start in the early 1980s. But when you think about it, in the 1990s, there are, I guess, many defining titles like Peter Bag's Hate or Daniel Klaus's 8-Ball. You know, the beginnings of Jimmy Corrigan and all of that, in addition to, let's say, you know, City of Glass that you've mentioned, or Stuck Rubber Baby, and work by Harvey Pekar. So it just, I find interesting that the 1990s, in terms of indie or alternative comics, seems to pack maybe even more of a punch than the 1980s. And I'm wondering if you guys felt that in doing the 1990s book.
Yeah, I felt that way. And it was a struggle, honestly, to really try and present a portrait of the full comic book industry. It was easy to focus on books like Valiant, Vertigo, Image, Topps, Marvel, and DC. But we make a point of talking about the non-alternative comics as well. We had to touch on the controversy around Dave Sim and alleged misogyny. We'll leave it at that. But we also had to touch on stuff like Harvey Pekar and Our Cancer Year, which might be his greatest work. And I think it's important for us to chronicle the full spectrum of comics. I do think there was a great book that just covers indie comics from the era. Our remit was really to do a broad spectrum of chronicling the industry. So we talk about everything from kids comics to kind of the most alternative comics, to the point where one of my favorite little anecdotes in the book was Fantagraphics, maybe one of the best publishers in North America, who published, you know, people like Dan Close and the Hernandez brothers, experienced major financial problems in the early part of the decade. And they were able to pay for the company to stay alive by producing a line of sex comics.
Right.
Their Eros line.
Eros line, right? And they at one point they had 20 or 30 different titles a month coming out through the Eros line. It was booming for them. And then by 1999, with the rise of the internet, that line started to crash on them, and they had to cancel not just that line, but a whole set of other indie comics that they were hoping to publish with the profits from it. And it's interesting how kind of everything is all tied together. We got the internet and, you know, the need to publish a book like 8-Ball, which is truly innovative, as well as, you know, these often crappy porn comics.
One of the things that, as you were pointing out, that you do cover, not only in the 1990s book, but, you know, in all of them in the series, are the various mainstream events, crossovers and tie-ins and what have you that defined each particular year. Now, I'm wondering, as the two of you were working on the 1990s book, if there were one or two DC or Marvel events that you felt were defining in terms of what the 90s were about, or were really notable to you for its time? And I know that there's a lot to choose from there.
I like how we both, neither one of us tries to touch that one.
Yeah, like, Keith, do you have something? No,
I guess DC versus Marvel.
Yeah.
I think that can sort of, you can point to that as an encapsulation of the decade.
Yeah, I think that's a great choice because it encapsulates the decade in a few ways. One is that it was an attempt to try and revive the industry at a point that it was really dying. By 1996, when that came out, industry sales had just basically fallen off a cliff, and it was an attempt to try and grab readership desperately. By January 96, cumulative industry sales were about 13 million, whereas at their peak they were 48 million. So it was about 25% of what industry sales were at the peak. And so they hoped to grab people into comic shop by finally showing people who would win a battle between Captain America and Batman, or Wolverine and Lobo. Marvel and DC both just blew that story so badly. It just engendered more anger at the companies. There was this great story, not great in the comic, but great background story about the battle between Wolverine and Lobo, which I think Peter David was asked to write. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Keith.
I think it was Ron Mars actually wrote that issue, yeah.
Yeah, and they didn't know how to. So first of all, fans were able to at that point, I think, just write in with their votes for who would win a battle. So they were able to vote between Storm and Wonder Woman, or Superman and Thor.
Superman and Hulk.
Superman and Hulk. But why don't you finish the story? You told it the other day.
Oh, okay. So, so I mean, obviously the writers are beholden to the fan vote. Again, I mean, the five matchups that the fans voted on: Batman versus Captain America, Hulk versus Superman, Superboy versus Spider-Man, Wolverine versus Lobo, and Wonder Woman versus Storm. So however the vote went, the writers essentially had to honor. And I mean, I know, Ron Mars and I are actually pretty good friends, and I forget if I ever asked him, because if you go back to the issue and the battle between Lobo and Wolverine, it of course happens in a bar, but the two square off and then jump behind a bar, and then Wolverine emerges, and that's it. That's the battle. So the whole battle essentially occurs off camera. And I can imagine Ron just sort of throwing up his hands and just being like, I don't know how to, write this battle. And just that becomes the joke of it, that they have a battle and you don't even see it. I'm sure many fans probably didn't appreciate that type of presentation, but it's, I don't envy Peter David and Ron Mars having to write this story, because it just is such a blatant gimmick, which makes it, again, I think, a perfect encapsulation of the 1990s, at least of mainstream comics.
Yeah, perfect encapsulation.
Yeah, and I want to ask more about what both of you have touched on, and that is the declining sales as we get into the 1990s, and how in many ways that's the result not only of some of the shenanigans that the publishers were engaged in, but also in terms of distribution as well. And I know that in 1995, you have, and in fact, you even titled the chapter of 1995 by calling it the Exclusivity Wars. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to how all of that contributed to the decline of sales in the 1990s.
I think that is the most important story of the decade. And I'm going to pass the baton off to Jason with that just chronicling the distribution war and what emerged from that. That is what, I think this is where a lot of sort of comic book fans get the decade wrong, is they'll look at the mediocre comic books and they say this is what destroyed the industry. No, that's not what destroyed the industry. What destroyed the industry was Marvel's decision to go exclusively with Heroes World. And Jason, I'll let you either agree or disagree with that.
Well, so by 95, there were 4,200 comic stores in America. In 1992, there were about 10,000. So the number of comic stores in the country were already cut in half by 1995. Now, that's a bit of a distortion. There's a lot of stores that didn't only sell comics or sold comics as a small part of their business. But if we take the idea that the industry was already half the size it was just 3 years before and continue from there, then it shows that comics were in trouble. That was made much worse when Marvel decided to buy a company called Heroes World and triggered the exclusivity wars. So basically, before 1995, there were several distributors in America. The number varies based on the number of companies in business and the size of the industry, but anywhere between 7 and 15 different distributors across the across the country. And generally, they were regional distributors. There are two major national distributors, Heroes World and Capital City Distribution. A major East Coast distributor named Heroes World was experiencing financial troubles in 94 and into 95. And at the end of the year, at the end of 1994, Marvel had reached an agreement to purchase Heroes World. And rumors circulated throughout the industry that Marvel would use them as their exclusive distributor, which triggered massive panic at the time. Marvel still, even despite the fact that Image and DC were on their heels, was still the number one company in America for comic sales. It turned out that Marvel did actually pull their books and distribute them exclusively through Heroes World, which was a catastrophe in a number of ways. Books didn't reach the retailers. Many retailers had to open multiple accounts, which meant that they would get lower discounts on their comics, and it just generally triggered a whole mess of additional problems. One of the most interesting things about that is that once Marvel went to a single distributor, there was a rush for other companies to move to a single distributor as well. Through a series of negotiations, DC ended up at Diamond Comics and actually had a period of time when they could actually buy out Diamond Comics. And that triggered all the minor publishers as well to move to exclusive distribution through Diamond, which meant all the other distributors throughout the country completely collapsed, and that Marvel owned, or rather Diamond owned the full set of distribution throughout the country, and really triggered the monopolistic system that we live in today. Marvel's move to Heroes World was a complete failure. It took them about 6 months to be able to build up enough experience at the business to be able to handle the size of the industry. And then Marvel pulled the plug on Heroes World after about 15 months, which basically meant that everyone at that point was only distributed through Diamond Comics, which meant they had monopolistic ability. The Department of Justice did actually investigate it, didn't find them to be a formal monopoly, which is fascinating. No, it's not that they didn't find it to be a formal monopoly, It's that the business was too small to have monopolistic.
Yeah, exactly right. That's exactly what I was going to say. It's because the comic book industry is so small that it's beneath the Justice Department's concerns. I'm sorry, Jason. I started to interrupt you.
Oh, that's okay. So that basically set the system that we have today, where we only have one distributor in America. Because comic shops were really squeezed in this deal, because either they couldn't get Marvel Comics or they couldn't get the discounts they did before, because when they were ordering through one distributor, they were able to get like 50 or 60% discounts on all their comics. Whereas if they went through multiple distributors, they only were able to get like 33% discounts, which wasn't enough to pay their employees and on their overhead. We went from like 5,000 comic stores in America to like 3,000 stores by 1996, 97. And it just continued to trigger this downhill slide in the industry in general.
And a lot of those stores, right, Jason, a lot of these stores could no longer be an exclusive comic book store. They had to supplement their revenues in some way, and a lot of them turn to Magic, the Gathering card game or toys. So it became a sort of hybrid store of, comics and collectible card games and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we still see that today, right? I mean, how many stores sell Magic and other cards and hold game nights and do things like that?
Yep.
You know, honestly, I think it is a smart marketing approach to try and sell different types of material. It just meant that the days of the pure comic store were really numbered at that point.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned this because I just thought of something that I guess my daughter told me not only just recently, but also she was telling me this like a few years ago as well. And I had been living in Frisco, Texas, in the Dallas area, and in Frisco there was no comic shop until a few years ago. And one opened up, a place called Doc's Comics, and it's pretty cool. But my daughter became, along with many of her friends, very much involved with what was going on at Doc's Comics in Frisco, Texas. But the way that they engaged with the shop was through gaming, and you know, Magic the Gathering was a big part of that, but also role playing games like of course D&D, and what is another one, like Pathways? I can't recall. But whenever my daughter would tell me I'm with my friends at the comic shop, you know, whereas initially I would think, oh, she's looking at comics and talking about comics or manga, whatever it is she was reading at the time. But no, it had everything to do with games. And that's something that I found relatively recently in a variety of shops. Not all the comic shops that I'm familiar with, but in many of them, that there is a heavily reliance on games, gaming, cards, and otherwise.
Yeah, because the profit the profit a retailer makes from comic book sales just cannot sustain their business. The amount of comic books that you would have to push out on a monthly basis is just tremendous. You have these retailers have to supplement their revenues, or else go out of business. And that's, to me, that is the legacy of the 1990s. That is one of the, I think, to me, that is the most significant legacy of the 1990s.
I hadn't thought about that. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that you have to be diverse. You got to be willing to sell other stuff. You can't just be a comic store.
Yeah.
Do you know? I mean, the number of retailers in the past 10 years who have complained about Diamond, and how they essentially they feel they are a franchise of Diamond Distributing, and it's there's not many happy retailers these days. And we could go through we can catalog the reasons why, but to me, the Diamond is right up there at the top of the list. That the retail complaints about Diamond, about how they do their business, about just the way they package the product, and how the product gets damaged or comes late, or even on the publisher side, about just trying to get into that previews catalog on a monthly basis, and how many publishers are shut out of that.
Now, and hearing you guys talk about some of the problems in the 1990s when it comes to, let's say, distribution, sales, and whatnot, I'm wondering how you would describe the differences in terms of the problems with comics in the 1990s from some of the problems that Keith, you wrote about in the 1980s volumes, because that decade also had its issues.
So, with the 80s, so you're starting out in the 80s with a newsstand model that is, I think it was Paul Levitz that told me that if not for the emergence of the direct market, the comic book industry as we know it would have died in like 1983 or 1984, something like that. So you're talking about, but even with the emergence of the direct market in the 1980s, you're still, a significant percentage of your comic book sales are coming from newsstands, are coming from stationery stores, grocery stores, the quote unquote where comic books have been traditionally sold. But by the 1990s, I think the publishers have become so enamored with the direct market, so beguiled by the prospect of no returns, that they devote essentially all their resources to the direct market. And I don't blame them, because the newsstand by the early 80s has proven that they could care less about comic books. So I don't blame comic book publishers from shifting their resources and energy to the direct market. But everything that we've just been describing for the past 15 minutes proves when you are reliant on essentially one sort of system of distribution and you have no backup plan, catastrophe is inevitably the end result. So that's how I would describe the difference between the 80s and 90s, is that even though the story of the 1980s, and I believe that the introduction to the 1980s volume states this, that the story of the 1980s is the emergence of the direct market, you still have a good portion of sales being directed through the newsstand, whereas by the early 1990s, I think Marvel by the early 1990s could care less about the newsstand.
Now, there is another trend that's really important too that kind of emerged in the 90s, which is the birth of the trade paperback, though, which is the other thing that really helped lead the comic industry back to health, because and Vertigo was really the leader in this. People weren't able to pick up each individual issue of Sandman, so Karen Berger smartly started collecting them into graphic novels, and those started selling like crazy, and it became a new model that comic shops and mainstream book publishers could use to really see the comics at anywhere, and is a place to kind of have this evergreen content that could build a larger audience and continually be something that people would want to read. And so that grew into being something that has now become all pervasive. I think we really saw that begin in the 1990s, particularly from Vertigo.
Great point.
And it's interesting that you should mention this, Jason, because I was just about to ask you guys. I mean, we had been talking about what I would consider kind of downer issues, right? You know, a dramatic drop in sales, distribution issues, the exclusivity wars. But I wanted to ask both of you what you consider kind of one of the biggest or most notable uplifting events or moments from the 1990s that kind of carries into today. And Jason, from the way that you were discussing the trade paperback and its rise in the 1990s, would you consider that one of those uplifting, hopeful moments from the 90s that has really defined in many ways the way we consume and engage with comics today?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, by the end of the decade, monthly comic sales were at their absolute worst that they ever had been. We began the decade in January 1990 with 10.6 million units sold per month in the comic industry. By the end of the year, we were down to 7. It peaked at 48 million. But in that 7, not included in that 7, is the growth of the graphic novel, which is people coming back, every 6 months to pick up a new volume of Sandman or The Authority or whatever the series may be. And that really has helped to give everyone a base of health in the comic industry, where we know that that there's a lot of there's a good solid set of reading material that will keep you involved and happy. So that's one of the key trends. The other is that to a great extent, Image Comics won kind of the war, even though they lost some of the battles in terms of internal fighting and sales, because by the end of the decade, it just became accepted in the normal part of the way of looking at the industry that you kept your rights to your characters that you created. By 1999, everyone knew that Warren Ellis was going to keep part of the Authority and Planetary, and he was going to be able to make a good living by getting royalties from these characters. And that's something that really wasn't part of the industry at the early part of the decade. Folks like McFarlane, Lee, and Liefeld really fought for that, and they achieved that goal. And I think that's a really important thing that we still see today. Obviously, we see it in something like Walking Dead, where Robert Kirkman's made a tremendous amount of money through his own intellectual property, as it should be. And I think that he's living in the shadow of the work that the Image creators and the Image founders were able to provide for him.
Well, as we round out our conversation, I want to ask the two of you, both collectively and individually, what you may be working on now or what we can look forward to in the future. Now, I know it's not 2000's volume of the American Comic Book Chronicles, but other than that, what might you guys have in the works?
Do you want to start? I actually... Jim Beard and I actually finished scripting a Ghostbusters one shot that's going to be published by IDW in late April. So excited to see that. I did because in 2019 that's the 35th anniversary of the premiere of the Ghostbusters movie.
Oh my God!
Hard to believe, man.
I feel so old now. Wow.
So IDW is celebrating that in a big way, and Jim Beard and I, who collaborated in 2010 on a Ghostbusters one shot, our editor contacted us to write a one shot of the Extreme Ghostbusters, which tied to the 1990s. That was one of the that was the follow up. That was the cartoon follow up to the real Ghostbusters. It only lasted one season. But it's actually a fun group of characters to write on. So I have that. We are the first 1940s volume is fully written, and we're about to design it. And other than that, I have a couple of creator-owned projects that I'm hoping to too soon to talk about, but hoping to really get off the ground.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, I have Jim Shooter Conversations, which is already out through University Press of Mississippi. I'm working on 2 more books for them, one on Steve Gerber and the other on Don McGregor. The Gerber book is slated to be out, I think, July of this year, and the McGregor probably in December. And then I have a couple of the other projects I'm working on as well.
Okay. So we can look forward to those projects in the relatively near future, definitely in this coming year. Keith, Jason, I want to thank both of you for taking the time on a January 1st, 2019 morning to talk with me about not only the kind of things that you're working on in general, but specifically the latest volume on the 1990s of the American Comic Book Chronicles series.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Derek. It's been fun.
Thanks again to Keith Dallas and Jason Sachs for coming back on the Comics Alternative to discuss their new book, American Comic Book Chronicles, the 1990s. It came out last month from TwoMorrows Publishing, and it's a must-read for any serious student of comics history. And if you want to find great prices on text like this, then head on over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As I mentioned at the top of the show, if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find great discounts on Keith and Jason's 1990s volume, as well as other works in TwoMorrows American Comic Book Chronicles series. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your books there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my interview with Jason Sachs and Keith Dallas. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can reach us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Podcasts. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We have more content lined up in the days to come, so be sure to check back for those episodes. Until then, take care.